thought the future would be cooler. I thought the future would be cooler.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Learning is the New Working. This is an episode that's part of Season 5. In Season 5, we talk to leaders, thought leaders, and researchers who have deep experience in the forces and trends at work on our discipline. Specifically in this episode, we're looking at the intersection between the world of higher education and the world of work. We believe that the changing dynamics of the workplace and the changing demographics in the world are contributing to significant disruption of the higher education sector, and that progressive organizations are engaging with traditional institutions from business schools to community colleges in very new and interesting ways. Our guest is Professor Sean Gallagher. He is the founder and executive director of Northeastern University's Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy, and he's the executive professor of education policy at Northeastern University. He also worked for a decade in EduVentures, advising executives at hundreds of universities, education companies, and investors, and he led the firm's most profitable business unit, developing and leading many of its research practices. Sean is a frequently invited speaker at industry conferences, and his writing and commentary have been featured in leading media outlets such as the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and CBS TV. Sean's research has also been cited in numerous academic papers, and his book, The Future of University Credentials, New Developments at the Intersection of Higher Education and Hiring, was published in 2016 by Harvard Education Press. He holds a Doctorate of Education, a PhD from Northeastern University, an MBA from the New York Institute of Technology, and a Bachelor of Science in Marketing from Northeastern. In our conversation, we talk about the forces at work on the higher education industry. We also talk about evolving modes of work-based learning, which is the intersection between work and hiring.
I thought the future would be cooler.
We also discuss how talent leaders can develop their own strategies around work-based learning. Listen in to my conversation with Sean Gallagher.
I thought the future would be cooler.
Sean, welcome to the podcast Learning is the New Working. Thanks so much for your time and the insights that I hope we're gonna get from you as we talk about the world of higher education and the workplace.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to join you.
Great. Well, I've got a few quick questions just to kind of frame up your work and your career. So we'll do those, and then we'll get conversational on some stuff. Okay.
Great.
Let's start by talking about where you live in the world and why.
Sure. So I live in Boston, which is a great city, great region. I was born here in New England. Went to college here. I've only lived in one other city for just a year. And I just found myself with two organizations over the last 20 years in terms of where I was working, both in Boston. And so I ended up staying. As part of that, I traveled the country and various parts of the world in my career. And every time I would land back in Boston, I would just be very happy about the institutions, the resources, the climate to some extent, besides the winter that's coming.
Yeah.
Started a family here, great schools. And I guess the short of it, career-wise as well, is it's just one of the premier cities in the world for academics and intellectual pursuits and this sort of work.
Yeah, of course. I mean, powerhouse academic institutions there, and a really great city, a very kind of European feel to it, I think, in some respects for an American city. Good spot.
Exactly.
Can you tell us what your job title is and the work that you're doing now, and perhaps color that in a little bit with the work that you really do on a daily basis? Not always the same thing.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it's a remarkably long job title, but it's pretty easy to explain, I hope. So I'm the executive director of the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy, and executive professor of educational policy, which is something like 25 words. I guess we have these long titles in academia. But as director of my own center at a university, I'm really focused on research and public engagement, executing projects, developing business, building new ideas, So a typical week, is doing research, conferences and presentations, lots of travel. I also have the privilege of advising some of our doctoral students, and I teach now and then. And I guess I'd emphasize this isn't traditional academic work. So I'm a full-time, non-tenured professor, and I'm not looking to publish in scholarly journals. It's very applied. It's studying what's happening in the marketplace, articles and reports that higher ed administrators and leaders and talent can use and can do something with.
Yeah, I mean, I love that sort of practicality, the sort of practical side of your work. Can you just color in a little bit what the main steps of your career journey were? How did you get to this cool role?
Sure. Yeah, I suppose like any career, it's been shaped by the times and the moment that you sort of begin and evolve. I started out in the original .com boom. So I got this space originally from a technology and education angle. I had begun my career in consulting, and it just happened to be that I found a firm called eduventures.com, was its name at the time, that was consulting and research for the education sector. This was back in the year 2000. And originally my major, my undergraduate degree is in business, but my original major was computer science. And I had a web design firm on the side, and I was really interested in being a kind of a technology industry analyst. So that was the angle that I entered into the space on, looking at some of the early LMS firms, the development of online education, those sorts of things. And I've just always liked being steeped in what's happening in industry. And then after 10 years at EduVentures, and over the course of that work, it was working with companies like Microsoft and IBM and institutions from Harvard to the University of Phoenix, really diverse range of institutions. I somehow became a higher education expert.
I love it. So learning technology, what's going on in the workplace and broader talent strategies, as well as this interface between academia and the world of work. These are all topics that are absolutely bang in the center of what we're trying to figure out at the Learning Futures Group. So I think we've got a lot of things to talk about, Sean.
Yeah, no, it's exciting times for these topics.
So maybe you could start by just framing up the size and scope of what's going on and the sort of trends of what's going on in the higher education sector for us.
Sure. So my work largely, but not only focuses on the U.S. So if we think about the U.S. higher education or post-secondary sector, there's about 20 million students. It's a big market, 20 million students in degree-granting institutions. There's many more who are doing non-credit professional development programs, things that are outside of the formal higher education system.
Mm-hmm.
About 40%, so not quite, but almost half of the students are adults or part-time. They're professional learners who are maybe mainly working and also studying. That's an important dynamic. In the U.S., we have the world's most developed and diverse higher ed system. There's 4,000 accredited colleges and universities.
Yeah.
That's a lot of institutions at obviously very different price points and missions and that sort of thing. In terms of revenue, the higher ed market's about $650 billion, a very significant portion of the economy or GDP, and about $200 billion of that is from tuition. And so as your listeners will probably know, if we were to expand it to the market for informal education and learning in the workplace, the market's a whole lot bigger. And that's just the U.S. The U.S. market is actually flat right now. And within it, we have post-baccalaureate learning or graduate education. Mm-hmm. For example, a university offering a certificate program or professional master's degree, online programs, that's booming. So you have one large sector, but there's many, many different segments of it that have, of course, different opportunities and challenges and growth rates.
Yeah, and a lot of change going on. I think maybe we could start about just sort of talking about the current picture in terms of talent. I mean, here in the United States, it's pretty extraordinary. We're close to full employment on the one hand, and yet there's a lot of anxiety about skill shortages, particularly tech and data related skills, and then a set of changes that we often characterize as the fourth industrial revolution, promising to bring a lot of change and disruption and automate a lot of the current work that's been done. There's a lot of anxiety about that impacting broad swaths of the population and sort of requiring a lot of reskilling and a lot of retraining. How do you track the data on these trends? And what would you characterize as the landscape? Have I missed anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think we really are in the fourth industrial revolution. And one of the clear things that's happening, and we're only starting to get good measurements on, is this topic of skills longevity.
Yeah.
Right. What's the shelf life or half life of skills? And the economists that I've seen looking at this and gathering some hard data on it, they're starting to illustrate just how real it is and how fast things are moving. The pace of work is quicker. Obviously, in software and coding, I think the common understanding is it's about 18 or 24 months. But what's happening is it's now extending to other occupations and other sectors of the economy. Probably the best example is marketing, where that has rapidly gone from something that was more about brand and advertising years and years ago to something that is quantified and digital and online. So in marketing, finance, supply chain, different zones of the job market and the economy, you have this change in the skills that are demanded at a much more rapid pace. And we're really at kind of peak demand for talent in the US, 7 million openings. I would note that about half of that is seeking a bachelor's degree or above. And so as much as there's a lot of noise, and maybe we'll talk about it later, about college education not being worth what it used to be worth, there's very strong demand for college educated talent. Not to say that colleges are perfect. And of course, also a lot of these jobs are driven by technology. We, as an institution and at my center, we do a lot of research and thinking about automation. And obviously, I don't think anyone can predict. There's some very good forecasts from McKinsey and other smart groups on what share of jobs might be automated or go away. I'm a little bit more in the optimistic camp. When you look at the history of technology over centuries, we actually did a survey, a Gallup poll nationally about a year or two ago, and it was called Optimism and Anxiety. So there's a little bit of both. I would also, just as a kind of final point on this question, highlight that automation and the anxiety around it is really emerging as a big corporate social responsibility issue.
Yeah.
You have PwC, I think, committed $3 billion recently, Amazon. And so those are some of the things that we're following.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting new dimension as companies are increasingly being held accountable, not just for making profits and feeding shareholders, but also doing good in the world. I think in the tech sector in particular, these companies have been held accountable for perhaps helping reskill people who are being displaced by technology. Interesting as well, there's an article from the World Economic Forum about this middle skill jobs, these so increasingly jobs that we might have thought of as not requiring digital and technical skills, increasingly requiring those skills. So whether it's kind of in manufacturing and lathe operations or in sort of medical assistant roles, everything's been digitized, everything's computerized, digital skills required at pretty much all levels of operation. Yeah.
We've built a program actually in advanced manufacturing in partnership with GE for precisely that reason. They have people on the shop floor who are very experienced with the technologies and systems they've been working with. But you go from traditional manufacturing to additive manufacturing, or you bring in robotics, or you need to do more data analytics. And all of a sudden that means there's a need for upskilling.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about universities, and I should preface this by the fact that I've just put 2 children through degrees at universities, and it was a non-trivial exercise, particularly from a financial perspective. But I think when I think of the top universities, they often sort of exude this sort of tradition and steadfast, solid kind of notions. And yet clearly there's a lot of disruptive forces at work on the higher education sector. Can you walk us through some of those macro forces at work on higher education institutions and from your perspective?